Okay, welcome everybody. Tonight we're going to be discussing the malacha of tochein, and tochein means to grind. So whenever you talk about the halachos of grinding of tochein on Shabbos, it's important to remember that there's really two parts to tochein. One has to do with the malacha of tochein, and then there's another part which really has nothing to do with the malacha. It's just and it's just related to tochein. So the first part is what we're going to be talking about tonight. The actual malacha of tochein, grinding. What is the problems? Is it a problem to grind anything? And exceptions to that. And the second part is that the Rabbanon, the rabbis, they made a decree, a gezerah against taking medicine, refuah, because of a concern lest you come to grind your medicine. So that is a big discussion that is related to grinding. But that's not going to be our topic tonight. Maybe we'll talk about it at a different time. But for our discussions, for our purposes tonight, we're going to just simply be talking about the malacha of tochein and what it applies to. So the first discussion, which gets a lot of airtime among the Rishonim, is, does tochein, grinding, apply to food? So Rashi has a Gemara in Shabbos that the Gemara says one who cuts, the Gemara uses this term silka into little pieces. The Gemara says that they're going to be chayiv mishum tochein. They're obligated because they were grinding. And similarly, if one crushes wood chips, they're also obligated because of tochein. Fine. But so the question is, what is this word silka? What does it mean? So Rashi says silka is a vegetable, and they on the side of the Gemara they say beet. They say it's a beet, and therefore it's prohibited to cut up any vegetables very small because that is called grinding. So Rashi's opinion is that grinding, the prohibition of grinding, also applies to food, and even cutting up your food into small pieces would be called grinding and would be a prohibition on Shabbos. But the Rush, he says, no, there's no way. You can't be prohibited to cut vegetables very small. How else are you going to eat your food? If you say you cut up your vegetables in small pieces, you're not going to be able to eat. You're going to have to eat in huge amounts. I mean, also think about it. You would even be cutting up food while you chew in your mouth. So the Rush, he understands that the word silka doesn't mean a vegetable. It means wood from a tree. So Rashi thinks that there is tochein, that you can do grinding on foods, but the Rush understands that no, you can't do any tochein on foods. It's interesting that the Torah who codifies much of a halacha, is one of the first to do it. He quotes the opinion of Rashi, but that's interesting because the Rush was his father, so the Torah ignores his father's opinion. He ignores the Rush's opinion, and he says like Rashi, and he says it's prohibited to cut vegetables very small, like Rashi's opinion. Although some understand that maybe the Torah, maybe the Torah's actual words is, he said that it's, you can't cut vegetables small because it's similar to tochein. He says domela tochein. So maybe that's because he really agrees to the Rush, but he doesn't want to. He agrees to his father. He doesn't want to argue on Rashi, and maybe the Rambam too. So that's the main opinions. The Rambam also as well. So the Rambam has an in between opinion, in between Rashi, who says yes tochein on foods, and the Rush, who says no tochein on foods. Rambam says tochein does apply to foods, but only if you're cutting up the vegetable in order to cook it is it a violation of tochein. Meaning, if you cut up the vegetable to eat, that's not called tochein. Only when you're preparing it to then be cooked, then that's called grinding. That's how he understood the malacha of tochein, and so therefore it only apply in that situation. Tosfos has a similar shita to the Rambam. He says that it's very similar. He said a vegetable that's edible raw, if you could eat this vegetable raw, then it's automatically not called tochein. So the difference between the Rambam and Tosfos, they both say some vegetables yes, some vegetables no. The Rambam would say you need to. It's all about you. Are you preparing to cook it or you're preparing to eat it. If you're preparing to cook it you yourself, then now you're doing grinding. Tosfos says no, as long as anybody, it might not be me. I could even want to cook this vegetable, but as long as somebody somewhere would eat this vegetable raw, then I'm automatically not doing the violation of tochein. I'm doing the malacha of tochein. So it seems like there's basically four opinions as to what would grinding apply to foods. It's the Rush says no. The Rambam says usually not unless you're cooking it. Tosfos says only if it's edible raw, and then you have Rashi who says yeah, you could do if you do grinding of foods, that's still a violation on Shabbos. So how does the Shulchan Aruch paskin? Shulchan Aruch, he says even though you have three opinions who basically say you can't only in very specific situations do you violate grinding on Shabbos for food. He paskins l'chumra. He's stringent, the Shulchan Aruch, and he says you can't cut up vegetables into small pieces. That's how he writes the halacha, and the Aruch HaShulchan he questions why does the Shulchan Aruch paskin that you can't do it. There's so many opinions that say it's not even a problem at all. But despite that, the Shulchan Aruch says you can't cut up vegetables into small pieces. Okay, so that's as it relates to food, but there are additional exceptions to this rule. And even though we say it does apply to food, despite the opinions of other Rishonim that it shouldn't, there are still additional exceptions. So the first exception, there's basically three main exceptions. So exception number one is what's called Gidule Karka, that the Trumas Hadeshen, he was of the opinion that you can only do that grinding is only a problem on a food that is Gidule Karka. What does that mean? It's on a food that grew from the ground. So if the food did not grow from the ground, um, then it's not going to be an issue because of tochein. That's going to be permitted. And indeed, it seems like that is paskind as halacha. The Ramah writes that it's prohibited to cut up raw meat and give it to birds. But he writes that because he doesn't say because it's tochein, he has this other prohibition because it's like you're turning something into food, but it not because it's grinding. So the Gra learns from this. He says that the Ramah is obviously holding that this is really an exception, that unless it's something that grows from the ground, right? And raw meat would not be something that grows from the ground, so raw meat would not be an issue of grinding because it is not gidule karka. So that's an important exception, number one. Only something that grows from the ground would be a violation of tochein. Another important exception to this rule is it's called ein tochein achar tochein, which means once something is grinded up once, now to grind it again would not be a problem because of grinding. So this is opinion of the Mordechai, the Ran, the Gos Maimonos. So these Rishonim they bring the opinion that anytime you grind something up once, to grind it up again is not a violation. And this is based on a Tosefta and Shabbos, that just like when something is already cooked, you can cook it. When something is cooked on Shabbos, you can cook it again. When something is baked, you can bake it again. So too, when something is already ground up, you can grind it again. There's no violation of tochein. So the Ramah, he writes, as halacha, he says it's permitted to, if you have a piece of bread, you can take that bread and break it into very small pieces, since the bread was already ground up, right? How did you make bread? You took grain, you took wheat, you grind it up into flour, baked it into bread. So there's already grinding done on this food. So for you to now take your piece of bread and take it into very small pieces, which maybe is an issue because of grinding, says the Ramah, it's not a problem because it's already ground up once. Not everyone, it seems to be not everyone holds of that. The Rashba, he understands that. It would seem to be that he doesn't understand this is true because he says to take this bread and to break it into small pieces and then eat it is only permitted based on another exception, which we'll get to in just a moment, which is the exception of miyad, something done for immediate use. But the implication is that otherwise, if it wasn't done for immediate use, it would be a prohibition, which would mean that the Rashba he holds that there is grinding after tochein. So that seems to be the Rashba's opinion. The Rambam perhaps holds like that. Maybe Tosfos Sarid. So it seems to be not everybody agrees to that as as a leniency, but there are some who do hold it, and maybe even it seems like the Rama holds like that too. But there are some limitations on this exception. The Machzis Shekel says if you're going to grind further, um, you know, like let's say you ground it up a little bit, but if you by you continuing to grind, it's going to get even more ground on Shabbos. So that would still be an issue. And there are other exceptions though as well, like maybe only man-made maybe man-made stuff that was already ground up would not be subject to this rule. But that seems to be the debate there. Some people say yes, this is exception, and some Rishonim hold no, this is not exception. Now the third exception, right? So far we've said that is there grinding on food? Maybe yes and maybe no. Shulchan Aruch Paskins, yes it is. And then even though despite this, there are some exceptions in addition to that, that it has to be something which is Gedule Karka grows from the ground. Um, and and some are lenient if it was already ground up once. Additionally, so we're coming back to this from the Rashba. So the Rashba says that just like we just learned Borer, right? Last week we learned Borer. In Borer, there were if three conditions were true, then we were able to separate something. So that was Ocha mitoch tolis, taking the good from the bad. You had to use biyad, using your hand. And the last one was miyad, if you're doing it for immediate use. So the Rashba says that the miyad, this last point in borer, not only does it apply to borer, it also applies to tochein, to grinding, which would mean anytime you're grinding, if you're going to grind for immediate use, then it's going to be permitted. And the Beis Yosef, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, and the Beis Yosef, he explains a little bit more. He tells you where he gets all his halachas from. So Beis Yosef, he says that he quotes this halacha of the Rashba, and he says it doesn't seem like anybody argues on him. That the Rashba's permission to do grinding, as long as it's done for immediate use. He says it seems like everybody agrees, and the Ran says everybody agrees with the Rashba as well. However, you can find people who disagree. The Magen Avram, he has an opinion. On the side of the Shulchan Aruch, he disagrees. He says no, this borer is nothing like tochein. It's not the same. Miyad does not apply to tochein. And some say also the Trumas Hadeshen, who is the opinion that bread is only permitted because it's there's ein tochein achar tochein, right? There's no grinding after it's already ground up. So that seems to imply the opposite, right? That just like we said from the Rashba, that we learn from there that he doesn't hold up the exception of grinding after grinding. So they learned that the Trumas Hadeshen must not hold of the permission to do it, of miyat to do it, as long as it's done right away. But that seems to be the debate. There's a question of what, why yes, why no? Why would you think that miyad, to do it for immediate use, why should it work for grinding, or why should it not work? So it might be because it all depends how you learn it, how you learn the reason that miyad even helps you for borer. This is just a little bit of a review from last week, that Rashi understood that the only reason why you can do something for immediate use for borer is because it's like a shinoi. You're doing something in an non-normal way, right? You're change the action to make it so strange when you separate for immediate use. So that might be true. That might be true for separating, but it says that's true for grinding. So maybe that's why it doesn't apply. On the other hand, maybe you could say like the Ran understand the ability to do miyad, to do for immediate use for borer. He understood that's all because that's just a normal way that you eat food, right? If you're going to separate it and you're doing it, to eat right away, that's just called normal way of eating. So that might apply here if you're going to cut up your small food just to eat it right away. So maybe it would make sense that it should apply. So it's interesting though, the Beis Yosef, right, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Beis Yosef explains more. He says nobody disagrees with the permission of the Rashba to do it for immediate use. That's what he says in Beis Yosef, but in Shulchan Aruch, he doesn't even mention the Rashba at all. He just doesn't say anything, which would imply that he doesn't agree to this kula, this leniency of the Rashba. However, for Ashkenazim, he does quote the leniency of the Rashba. He says anytime you're doing it for immediate use, it's no problem. You're not grinding. You're all good. But we're not totally in the clear because although the Ramah says this, the Mishnah Brura, he says, yeah, that's all true. And there are a lot of leniencies. We've already quoted so many leniencies. Maybe it doesn't apply to food. Maybe there's maybe once it's already grounded up, maybe it does only apply if it grows from the ground, right? The Mishnah Berurah says still, in order to avoid any issues, if you want to avoid any issues whatsoever and be totally clear, he recommends cutting your pieces, or let's say you're cutting um up a vegetable, so you should cut the pieces bigger than you normally would. Right, if you're cutting something like chicken, right, then that's probably okay anyways, because that's not doesn't grow from the ground. But if you're cutting up vegetables, then maybe it would make sense to cut the pieces bigger than you normally would. The question is, the Mishnah Berurah writes this. He says, cut the pieces bigger than you normally would. The question is, what's big and what's small? So this is already a big fight from a long time ago. The Uraim says he doesn't know what's big or small. Some later poskim they say Chazon Ish says you cut it bigger than you normally would cut it. Shmir Shabbos writes as long as you still have to chew it, that's not called cutting it up really small. That's not called grinding. The Kobe Talachos, he says as long as the pieces are bigger than the way you would normally mince vegetables, that's okay. Rav Ramon writes that he writes that if you cut them small enough that it's hard to identify the vegetables, then that's called cutting them up to grinding. So I think we say that if you cut them a tiny bit bigger than normal, so normally people are lenient about that, since you also have all the opinions of maybe it works if you're doing it for immediate use, and you have the opinion of the rush that maybe it doesn't even apply to foods. So there are a lot of reasons to be lenient about this. I remember we asked Rav Sobolovsky if around a month ago, we asked him this question. We said, how big is big? How small is small? And he said if the Uraim didn't know, how am I supposed to know? So okay, so that's what Rav Sobolovsky said. It's important to know though that the Biur Halacha, he writes that that since this leniency of miyad only applies for borer, where we had for borer we said miyad, but we said that's only true when you have the other exceptions, which was biyad, using your hand, and also ochel mital psolis. But the Biur Halacha says so too for tochein, for grinding, even if you're going to do biyad, even if you're going to do it miyad, meaning for immediate use, it's only going to work if it's biyad, meaning with your hands. So he says to use like a grinder, that for sure is going to be not allowed, because now just like for borer wasn't allowed if you're going to use a special tool. So too for grinding, if you're going to use a special tool, even if you're going to do it for immediate use, that's not going to be permitted. And some say maybe it's even like special knives that are designated for like dicing up vegetables. The knife is specifically for this purpose. Maybe that's not going to be good either. So that is that. Those are the basic exceptions, and then finally, this will just be the last point for tonight, and then that'll be it on tochein, on grinding, at least for the malacha. The last point is, what if you wanted to, not cut something up small? What if you wanted to like mash something? There's a big discussion about mashing a banana. That's where the fight is, about mashing a banana. So the Chazon Ish is basically a fight between the Chazon Ish and Rav Moshe Feinstein. So the Chazon Ish he said that for you to mash a banana, that's actually the worst that's even worse than cutting up something small, right? That's the worst type of grinding that you could do. And he says that, although you have a lot of leniencies, we quote a lot of leniencies. We said the rush doesn't hold up that would apply to food. And the Rambam also was very particular, and the Tosfos too. He says we don't poskim like any of those where the Shulchan Aruch was machmir anyways. He told us that it does apply to food. And he said the Rashba said that if you do it for immediate use, that's going to be permitted. He says, yeah, that's true, but that doesn't apply to if you mash something. Mashing has a different set of rules. Even though it's grinding, it's more stringent. It's called risuk mashing. He says so it's not going to it's basically going to be the worst, and it doesn't even work even if you want to do it for immediate use. So for Moshe, before I get to Rav Moshe, so Chazon Ish said, he said that that's going to be actually prohibited on a biblical level to mash a banana, and then to eat it, and because that would be the worst type of grinding. But the Chazon Ish, he said, although that was true, you can have a banana and mash it if you're going to do it kila achar yad. What does kila achar yad mean? It means in like with the back of your hand, with the shinoi, in a weird way. So he says if you take, this is what he says to do it. This would be the weird way. So he says if you take your spoon and you take the back of the spoon and then you mash your banana, he says that's really strange. That's not normal. And then you can mash your banana. That's not a problem. So that was the opinion of the Chazon Ish. Rav Moshe basically disagreed with everything he said. He said, he said, um, to mash a banana, he said, first of all, the Rashba is right. And for you to do something for immediate use, it would work. And even for mashing. And then he says, mashing is totally permitted. That's not even called grinding. Like you're taking a banana and instead of cutting it into small pieces, it's one big mush. So that's not grinding. It's supposed to just taking something and cutting it into a bunch of small pieces. Okay, that's called grinding. But when your banana just remains as one big banana that's just smushed, that's not grinding at all. And it's totally permitted. He says, and he brings a proof. He says the Rambam when he talks about grinding, he says you're basically taking like one body and turning it into many different bodies. Right, so it would make sense, right? That's a support for Rav Moshe's opinion that to mash a banana into one big mush is not called grinding. But he said I don't, even the Chazon Ish, he says, and then if you want to understand, like let's say the Chazon Ish was right, and that to mash a banana was actually the worst kind of grinding that you could do. He says, I don't understand. The back of the spoon shouldn't even help you. That's because the Chazon Ish is holding that grinding would be prohibited on a biblical level. So to use the back of your spoon, that would still shouldn't even help you. That would only make it still prohibited on rabbinical levels. He says, I totally don't understand. Is the Chazon Ish, I disagree about the first part, and I disagree about the second part too. But he said, so Moshe said, he says, so what should you do? He said, okay, since I think it's totally permitted anyway, if you want to be stringent like the Chazon Ish, um, he said maybe okay, you should be stringent like the Chazon Ish and use the back of your spoon, even though I don't really think it's a problem anyways. But if you want to be stringent like him, okay, you can rely on his leniency, which is to use the back of the spoon. So that was what Moshe said about the Chazon Ish. So it seemed like mashing bananas, those who want to be stringent like the Chazon Ish should use the back of their spoon, and then that would not be a problem either according to Moshe Feinstein or the Chazon Ish. Okay, so we'll stop there. We'll stop there for tochein, for grinding, at least part one. And then maybe a different week we'll talk about the second part of grinding, which is the Isser Refuah, the prohibition on taking medications, which comes as a result, as a concern that maybe people will grind. Does anyone have any questions?